Nick Hayes is my name. I'm in charge of technology at Wellntel. Joe Fillingham is here as well. Joe is our science lead. We're going to host about a 20-minute presentation on how to set up a community groundwater network. This is a new and emerging opportunity for folks who care about or work in resources or in groundwater specifically. And we want to make sure that you're aware of how others are taking advantage of this opportunity. As a quick agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about who is setting up community groundwater networks and why they're doing it and how they're doing it and what we can provide along the way, and then some tips in terms of how to get started. Specifically, this is an image of an installation that took place last week as part of a groundwater monitoring network that's building in New Mexico, sponsored by the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Sciences. This is actually from their Facebook page. A system of many wells is being created in New Mexico, and this was one of the installations in a domestic well that happens to be a solar-powered pumping well at one of the participants' locations. Groundwater monitoring networks, community groundwater monitoring networks, are systems that need sponsors. Sponsors are townships or villages or counties, HOAs, homeowners associations, rural water districts, scientific agencies, sometimes land trusts and conservancies. And what these organizations are doing is sponsoring dense Wellntel groundwater information system networks that gather and share groundwater level data on a scale that's never been seen before. This map is a map of some of the installations that went up last year, and the blue circles on it are some of the highlight community networks within those installations. And we're going to go deeper into some of the information that's being pulled from those networks in just a few minutes. A community network really is made up of two constituents: sponsors who sponsor the networks and participants who participate in the network. It's just that simple. A sponsor, as I mentioned, possibly a rural water agency or a village or a township, is essentially providing equipment through gifting or financial rebates or subsidies, or possibly even data leasing opportunities into wells that become instrumented wells on domestic land. Typically domestic wells used by homeowners and sometimes small farmers, who then participate in the community network, and in return for this sponsor financial contribution, provide unencumbered access to the groundwater information from their systems. Now, the benefit to these two constituents differ. In the case of the sponsor, we're really talking about a giant economic benefit, up to a 30-to-1 investment advantage over prior technologies or conventional technologies that would have been used for groundwater level monitoring systems before. So instead of complex networks of wells that depend on people to be dispatched to go take measurements once in a while, or instead of expensive in-water equipment that's not allowed on domestic wells and is difficult to apply telemetry to, what happens with sponsored Wellntel community networks is that an existing budget that was sized for sparse data collection can now be leveraged into very dense, large-scale networks. On the participant side, the benefits are different. So if you, for example, are a homeowner who elects to participate in a sponsored community network, what you're getting for the first time ever is information about what's happening inside your well. And so to the homeowner, that may not mean focusing, for example, on weather events or recovery periods or risk in a certain area of a region. Instead, it might net benefits like having operational data to minimize risk. If groundwater levels are nearing a pump can be protected before it in fact is damaged. But additionally, the participant is in a position to become a voice for the information. a groundwater advocate, if you will, locally to show up at meetings and actually speak from a factual position. Now, what that means is the participant is seeing lower costs as well, but additionally has greater community involvement. Now, what can a community network do specifically? This is an array of instruments that are deployed and are gathering groundwater level from all sorts of different locations within a region. Let us show you some of the data that is being gathered in one such community network, and I'll have Joe specifically speak to these next three charts.
Thanks, Nick. So this is a whole batch of data, and it looks really nice and messy. Basically, what you're looking at is information from 17 wells in a 10 square mile area in Central California. This is a region where Wellntel sponsors a network of sites. And what we're trying to show here is that when you start aggregating these really dense community networks, you get a large number of wells monitored, and that really helps paint the full picture of long-term groundwater level change. You can clearly see in each one of these dots, which represents monthly average water levels for an individual well, that there's quite a lot of noise and quite a lot of variation. And that, of course, is due to how the water is used and everything else. But when all of those data are put together and can be looked at together, you start to see the full picture of how that water level is changing in that region. And so if we look at this a little bit more cleanly, you're now seeing the distribution across all sites for each month in that same network, in that 10 kilometer square region. You start to really clearly see the trend in water level. And what you're able to do is put some statistical power into the data. And the data is allowing you to have some statistical power in understanding these trends. So following those blue dots and the blue line, which represent the median of each of these distributions for months in 2016 and 2017, you can follow to the next chart, which is allowing us to connect both the statistical power of the data to what's really going on in this region and develop a deeper understanding of this groundwater resource. So this chart is showing you the total precipitation at a couple of different weather stations in this area, in the region of this local network in California. And you can really see the strong tie between the wet seasons and the dry seasons, and how the water level changes in this area as a response to these environmental forces. So really, these dense data are allowing us to have, a full picture of what's going on in this region. They're giving us some statistical power in how we can understand and evaluate those data over time. And then they're allowing us to develop a deeper understanding of our groundwater resource.
Super. And Joe, I would just add that one of the things we'll do as a follow-up to this webinar is post a very short 12-second video that takes these months in this region and creates a contour map from the region. We'll post it to YouTube and forward a link to all of the participants. So what does Wellntel provide in a groundwater, a community groundwater network? Well, really, it comes down to kind of four high-level things, and I'm gonna get into the details of how we go about this as we move into the next few slides. But we begin by essentially helping sponsors create a program, and what that means is actually recruiting participants and volunteers to that program, and then agreeing on how the information is going to be used and shared. And that means that there actually is a contract usually. And that contract is something that we can provide boilerplates for. Now, that doesn't mean that we will account for every specific legal or legislative issue or regulatory issue in every region. So there are some adaptations that will need to be made by those who work from those boilerplates, but we can give it a starting point. And what that helps to do is frame up the expectations for everybody involved on the participant side and on the sponsor side. The second thing we can help do is provide a lot of application support to essentially pick the best monitoring locations Now, instead of thinking about only monitoring locations from the perspective of, am I triangulated geographically, or am I close enough to a surface water source that I care about? Instead of only thinking about it that way, we might also be thinking about which wells are best suited, which areas have the most risk or opportunity, which locations, now that we're talking about both public and private land, have the ability to be essentially monitored for the first time. So we can provide a lot of support on picking best monitoring locations. We will also provide technical support to simplify and speed deployments, and sometimes that means actually participating in installations like you saw happening last week in New Mexico in that earlier photograph. And then as data is collected, we'll provide a lot of data use and analytics support as required. Now I'm showing two images from our actual dashboard. The image on the left is the map of wells in an emerging network in New Mexico. The image on the right is one of the owners, one of the participants in that system is just booted up last week and has been trending about a 1 foot variation in water level, only gathering static water level on the right-hand side. And that, in fact, is the owner's well, and they're seeing that data. It's worth talking a little bit about what the Wellntel groundwater information is as a starting point in order to move a little bit more deeply into application thinking and site selection thinking. And then frankly, in the context of the relationship that will be made between sponsors and participants. So at the very beginning of Wellntel, when we launched a couple of years ago, what we were doing is essentially making it possible for any domestic well to become a monitoring station. But that meant that we had to embrace a whole bunch of commitments to those folks whose well would have instruments on it. One, it needed to be accurate. We didn't want to make decisions based on inaccuracy. It needed to be reliable and simple to install. We didn't want to create a barrier to being able to instrument a well. So it needs to be something that pretty much any do-it-yourselfer can get their head around and work on with simple tools. It needs to be flexible. That means it needs to be useful on domestic and small farm wells in addition to monitoring wells, which is where agencies typically go today. It needs to be communicative. That is, the sensors that are on wells must transmit automatically across existing internet, or where existing internet isn't via cellular, or potentially do some data logging when the sites are very remote. It needs to, in order to be scalable, needs to be very easily managed. And that means that calibration, alerting, time interval programming, and more needs to be able to be done remotely. So we don't have to send people to site all the time, especially in long distances. It needs to be available. That is, the data needs to be accessed across multiple formats, but not, frankly, in spreadsheets shared via email. Instead, via things like apps and a simple browser interface. And one of the most important characteristics of the system is that it needs to be secure. And so this is essentially a military-grade instrument at a consumer price. It's end-to-end encrypted and password protected, and the only people that have access to the data are the sponsors and the participants in the program. Now, what this really is it's an instrument that is well stationed and data that is being gathered on the internet. And so it's important to talk a little bit about how a sponsor interfaces or works with this data in the cloud. So recently, we published a blog about a new sponsor dashboard capability, and I just want to emphasize some of the features that are in that dashboard. So on the right-hand side, you're looking at a map of wells in a sponsored system that happens to be in Northwest Wisconsin, and the green dots indicate a system broadcasting as it should be, without any risk condition or alerting condition. But the red dot that you see is a well that's in alert, and that may mean that there is a risk condition in the well, like, for example, the water level has gotten too close to the pump level, or it might also mean that the sensor needs some attention, like a battery replaced. But that red dot alert essentially calls a sponsor or a participant's attention to that well, and they can take action to keep it up. On the left-hand side, you're seeing, though, that this region has been organized into sites. And so features-wise, what happens here is a sponsor, which may be a single main administrator, can add and manage many users, both owners and their employees and service technicians, to use this site, and they can organize all of the wells, all the monitoring stations in this site into groups and locations in intelligent ways. Some sponsors like to organize by depth to water averages, because it means that we're talking about a confined versus an unconfined aquifer being measured. Some sponsors like to do it in terms of land, areas where they're dispatching scientists or spokespeople to talk with participants about what the data is saying. Sponsor capabilities delivered by Wellntel also include fleet automation. For example, all of the data is automatically delivered to this dashboard. So it's a real-time system, meaning there's no batch of pushing information from instruments after gathering this in the field. It's pushed to the web right away, and both the sponsors and the participants are accessing it essentially seconds after readings are taken. We provide sponsors with a whole bunch of stakeholder or participant value adds. For example, one way to organize a participant's dashboard is to have it be very simple, and another is to crank it up with alerts that might engage the participant in information that's important to them, like water level to the pump, or recovery periods extending, or pump cycling that could indicate leaks and lower their costs in the long run. Later this year, we will also be unveiling what we call an API subscription. This is an opportunity for sponsors to link Wellntel data to environmental websites and their own models in real time. So that means a state agency may live feed Wellntel data through the agency website. They may also live feed Wellntel data right into their scientific models and be able to drive animation from it. I want to provide a budgeting example for a sponsor who might be thinking about the first community network. So let's say that that there was an existing budget of $30,000 to dig 2 monitoring stations on public land and outfit them with either pressure transducers or maybe dispatch technicians to those locations on some schedule for data. A $30,000 project budget deployed using the Wellntel community monitoring approach might net 30 to 40 new locations on private domestic wells. Think about that. From 2 to 40 is a giant leap up in terms of data richness, density, and scale. But additionally, instead of thinking about this just in terms of the regional scale, let's think about it temporally as well. Wellntel, with a decent power and telemetry system as its underpinnings, will provide up to a 5-minute time interval, and sometimes even faster than that. So the information that can be delivered is just, well, it is big data, frankly, on the groundwater side, and it has the ability to reveal things in models that essentially have never been revealable before. One way that can happen, for example, is instead of just thinking about static water level as readings taken absent of pump influence, Wellntel provides the ability to actually tag readings taken while pumps are running and metadata, and tag them with meta tags that enable the ability to say this is pump influenced or it isn't, and use that information about pump influence to further a study. Within a budget of $30,000, we would provide training to the team, the sponsor team, and first startup support to the sponsor team, and of course remote calibration and fleet monitoring. So it's a whole program multi-year program, frankly, with multi-locations in a giant impact in terms of information and knowledge for a very low cost. Now, how would a sponsor get started? If you are potentially interested in pursuing a network, then tell us about your existing networks and your future needs. Give us a call. What we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about locations, and we'd like to learn a little bit about local construction methods and what you know there. If there are things like construction reports or not, are these well seals or well caps, all the little nuanced details of applying an instrument. We'd like to talk about the needs of the population you serve in your agency. Are you doing this for a business, or are you doing this for a county? Um, how do you want the data exchanged and shared? Once we have a little bit of background information, we'll assist with program design and site planning and well suitability and drive all of those application questions. And we will then figure out when we can come out and focus where the system is easiest and most impactful, with no need to cover old ground, essentially to uncover new ground and create the first ever community network in your region.